The machines never stopped beeping, but one day they almost did. The room was filled with the cold, mechanical rhythm of life being measured in numbers, heart rate, oxygen levels, breaths per minute. A little girl lay motionless on the hospital bed, her fragile body barely rising under the weight of exhaustion. Doctors had tried everything. Specialists had come and gone. Money had been spent like water, and yet nothing worked. But what no one knew was that the answer would come from someone no one ever noticed. Before we begin, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the idea that even the smallest act can change a life, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to the channel. You never know who might need this story. The girl's name was Emily Carter, the only daughter of one of the wealthiest businessmen in the city. Her father, Richard Carter, had built an empire from nothing, rising from poverty to unimaginable wealth. He owned skyscrapers, companies, and influence, but none of it could buy the one thing he desperately needed: his daughter's health. Emily had been sick for as long as anyone could remember. What started as mild fatigue in her early childhood slowly turned into something far more terrifying. She became weaker with each passing year, her immune system failing, her body unable to fight even the smallest infections. Doctors labeled it a rare, complicated condition, one that didn't have a clear cure. Richard spared no expense. The best hospitals, the most advanced treatments, experimental therapies from around the world. Private jets flew doctors in overnight. Entire hospital wings were reserved just for her care. But despite all the money, all the expertise, Emily only got worse. Her mother, Clara, was the only one who stayed by her side constantly. She rarely slept, rarely left the room. Her once radiant face had grown pale and hollow, her eyes permanently filled with quiet fear. She held Emily's hand for hours, whispering prayers she wasn't sure anyone was hearing anymore. Richard, on the other hand, had become a different kind of broken. He buried himself in work, not because he didn't care, but because it was the only way he knew how to cope. He controlled everything in his business world, but here, in this hospital room, he was powerless. And then there was the nanny. Her name was Maria. She wasn't supposed to be important. In fact, most people barely noticed her. She had been hired quietly, almost as an afterthought, when Clara could no longer handle everything alone. Maria came from a poor background, a woman who had known struggle her entire life. She didn't have degrees or connections. She didn't speak much. She simply did her job, cleaning, helping, sitting quietly beside Emily when needed. To Richard, she was just another employee. To Clara, she was a small relief in a life filled with exhaustion. But to Emily, she became something else. Maria had a warmth about her that couldn't be explained. She didn't treat Emily like a fragile patient or a problem to be solved. She treated her like a child who still had life left to live. She would gently brush her hair, hum soft lullabies from her childhood, and tell simple stories, not about castles or riches, but about resilience, hope, and ordinary people finding strength in impossible situations. For the first time in years, Emily began to smile, even if only faintly. At first, no one noticed the change. Doctors still saw declining reports. Machines still showed unstable readings. Richard still signed checks and demanded results. But Maria saw something deeper, something the machines couldn't measure. Emily wasn't just physically sick. She was losing the will to fight, and Maria knew that no medicine could fix that. Days turned into weeks, and Maria began doing something unusual. Every morning, she would gently open the curtains, letting sunlight pour into the sterile hospital room. She would sit beside Emily and speak to her, not about illness, but about life outside those walls. The smell of rain, the laughter of children, the feeling of grass under bare feet. At first, Emily barely responded, but slowly, something shifted. Her eyes would open a little longer. Her breathing would steady. Sometimes she would even squeeze Maria's hand in response. One evening, when the machines beeped a little slower than usual, Maria did something that would change everything. She asked the doctors for permission to take Emily outside. They refused immediately. It was too risky. Her immune system was too weak. One wrong exposure could be fatal. Richard agreed with them without hesitation, but Maria didn't stop. She waited. And one quiet morning, when the hospital was calm and Clara had finally fallen asleep from exhaustion, Maria gently wrapped Emily in blankets, placed a mask over her face, and wheeled her out of the room. Step by step, breath by breath, she took her outside. The air was fresh. The sky was clear. Birds chirped in the distance, and sunlight touched Emily's face for the first time in months. For a moment, nothing happened, and then Emily blinked. Her fingers moved slightly. Her chest rose a little deeper than before. Maria knelt beside her, holding her hand, whispering softly that she was safe, that she was alive, that the world was still waiting for her. Tears filled Maria's eyes as she saw something she hadn't seen before. Hope. When the hospital staff discovered what she had done, chaos erupted. Doctors rushed in furious. Richard was called immediately. The risk had been enormous. The consequences could have been devastating. Maria expected to be fired on the spot, but something stopped everyone in their tracks. Emily's vitals. For the first time in months, they had improved. It didn't make sense. There was no medical explanation. No treatment had been administered. No procedure had been done. And yet, her condition had stabilized. Days passed and the improvement continued. Slowly, steadily, unbelievably, Emily began to recover. Her strength returned little by little. Her appetite improved. The machines that once screamed warnings now hummed in quiet rhythm. Doctors were stunned. Richard was speechless. Clara wept like she hadn't in years, but this time they were tears of relief. And Maria, she simply continued sitting beside Emily, holding her hand like she always had. Eventually, Richard asked to speak with her. For the first time, he truly looked at the woman he had barely acknowledged before. He asked her why she did it, why she risked everything for a child who wasn't hers. Maria didn't speak about medicine or knowledge. She spoke about loneliness. She explained that Emily wasn't just sick in body. She was trapped, surrounded by fear, machines, and silence. She had forgotten what it meant to feel alive. And sometimes the body follows the heart. Richard stood there, unable to respond. For the first time in his life, he realized that all his wealth had built walls around his daughter instead of giving her life. Weeks turned into months, and Emily continued to improve. Eventually, she was strong enough to leave the hospital. The day she walked out, holding both her mother's hand and Maria's, felt like a miracle no one could explain. But the biggest change wasn't just in Emily. It was in Richard. He began to spend more time at home. He laughed more. He listened more. He became present, not just as a provider, but as a father. And Maria, she was no longer just the nanny. She became family. If this story is touching your heart so far, take a moment right now to share how you feel in the comments. Your words might inspire someone else who's struggling to hold on. Years later, people would still talk about the miracle that saved Emily Carter. Some called it luck. Others called it science finally catching up. But those who truly understood knew the truth. It wasn't money. It wasn't medicine. It was kindness. It was courage. It was one person refusing to accept that nothing could be done. And in the end, that made all the difference. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that even the smallest act of love can change a life, don't forget to like, comment, and share this video. And subscribe for more stories that remind us what truly matters in this world. Oh, because sometimes the impossible is just waiting for someone brave enough to try. The miracle didn't end at the hospital doors. In many ways, that was only the beginning. Life after illness is never as simple as people imagine. For Emily, stepping outside into the world wasn't just a recovery. It was a rebirth into something unfamiliar, overwhelming, and at times, frightening. The same sunlight that once healed her now felt too bright. The laughter of other children felt distant, like something she had missed out on for too long. But this time, she wasn't alone. Maria stayed by her side, not as a caretaker anymore, but as a quiet guide into a world Emily was learning to live in for the very first time. Every morning, instead of hospital machines, Emily woke up to the soft sound of birds and the gentle presence of someone who believed in her more than she believed in herself. Clara watched it all with a heart full of gratitude she could barely express. She had spent years fearing the worst, preparing herself for loss. Now she found herself learning how to live again, too. She started cooking again, smiling again, even laughing, something that once felt impossible. But the biggest transformation was in Richard. For years, he had measured life in numbers, profits, investments, growth. Now he found himself measuring something entirely different. The number of steps Emily could take without getting tired, the number of minutes she could laugh before coughing, the number of moments he could spend beside her before work tried to pull him away. And slowly, work began to lose its grip on him. He started canceling meetings, delegating responsibilities, walking away from deals that once would have consumed his entire attention. His business partners were shocked, some even worried. But Richard didn't care, because for the first time he understood something money had never taught him. Time was the only real wealth. One afternoon, as he stood in the garden watching Emily take small, careful steps across the grass, he felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest. Regret. Not the kind that passes quickly, but the kind that lingers, heavy and undeniable. Regret for the birthdays he missed, the nights he chose meetings over bedtime stories, the years he believed providing was the same as being present. And standing just a few steps away was Maria. She hadn't changed much. Still simple, still quiet, still wearing the same gentle expression that had once gone unnoticed. But now Richard saw her clearly, not as an employee, but as the person who gave his daughter a second chance at life. That evening he made a decision that would change not just their lives, but many others. Richard began funding a new foundation, one dedicated not just to medical treatment, but to emotional healing for children with long-term illnesses. Hospitals were redesigned with open spaces, gardens, sunlight, and human connection at their core. Doctors were trained not just to treat symptoms, but to nurture hope. And at the heart of it all was an idea inspired by Maria, because she had shown them something the world often forgets, that healing isn't always found in medicine alone. Months passed, and Emily grew stronger. Her laughter became louder, her steps more confident. She started going to school, making friends, discovering the simple joys of being a child. But there were still moments. Moments when fear crept back in. Nights when she would wake up, breathing fast, her mind filled with memories of machines, cold rooms, and uncertainty. In those moments, it wasn't doctors or medicine she called for. It was Maria, and Maria always came. She would sit beside her just like before, holding her hand, reminding her gently that she was safe now, that the darkness had passed, that she was stronger than she realized. And slowly, Emily would calm down. Because some bonds are built not through time, but through truth, pain, and unwavering presence. One day, years later, Emily stood in front of a crowd. She was no longer the fragile little girl from the hospital bed. She stood tall, confident, her voice steady as she spoke about her journey. About the illness, the fear, the loneliness, and the moment everything changed. She didn't talk about expensive treatments. She didn't talk about advanced medicine. She talked about a woman who believed in her when she had stopped believing in herself. She talked about kindness. And as she spoke, her eyes searched the crowd until they found Maria, standing quietly in the back, just like always. Tears filled Maria's eyes, but she didn't move forward, didn't seek attention, because she had never done it for recognition. She had done it because something inside her simply refused to give up on a child who still had life left to live. After the speech, Emily walked straight to her, and without hesitation, she hugged her tightly. It wasn't the kind of hug you give out of politeness. It was the kind that carries years of gratitude, love, and unspoken understanding. The kind that says everything words never could. Time continued to move forward as it always does. Emily grew up, Richard grew wiser, Clara found peace, and Maria remained exactly who she had always been, but her impact reached far beyond that one family. Thousands of children benefited from the foundation inspired by her actions. Hospitals changed, perspectives shifted. People began to understand that sometimes the simplest human connection can achieve what even the most advanced science cannot. And all of it began with one decision, one moment, one act of courage that no one expected from someone no one noticed. Before we reach the end of this story, I want to ask you something special. This journey touched your heart even a little. Write a kindness changes lives in the comments. Let's fill this space with a reminder that even the smallest act can make the biggest difference. Because stories like this aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to be lived. In a world that often celebrates power, wealth, and status, it's easy to overlook the quiet heroes. The ones who don't have titles, who don't seek attention, who don't expect anything in return. But sometimes they are the ones who change everything. And maybe, just maybe, the next miracle won't come from someone powerful. It might come from someone like Maria, someone who simply chooses to care. If this story truly moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps spread stories that remind us of what really matters, because at the end of the day, it's not about how much we have, it's about how much love we're willing to give.